Hello, y'all. You got Doug Gore with the Spray Wash Academy, and we're going to do another episode with Miss Nicole Royer. Miss Nicole Royer works for BWI Fly. And tell us one more time a little bit about yourself, Miss Nicole.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me again. And I work for BWI Aviation Insurance, and I specialize in all the drone insurance policies that come through our office.
Awesome, awesome. And so this episode is going to be a little bit about what affects my rates and dealing with the subcontracting side, whether you are the subcontractor or you're hiring a subcontractor that owns a drone, that kind of thing. So we'll get into many different aspects of that. So let's start off, Ms. Nicole, with how is insurance, aviation drone insurance specifically rated? Is it estimated by the amount of flight hours that the pilot has, or is it based on the revenue? Because I know with some things it's based, like in the general liability world and in the what's the other world that I'm looking for? The workers' comp world. It's all based on revenue or some other formula. So how is that rated in the drone world?
Yeah, so in there's many factors that go into it. So in the drone world and in aviation, it gets a little bit more complicated because there's so many different entities and things you can use drones for. So it's really going to depend on what your use is, for one. Yes, experience can play a part. Hours you anticipate on flying a year versus hours you have flown. And the experience you have is definitely going to play a factor into that. And then many other things, like what type of risks are we insuring? Are you doing surveying? Are you doing mapping? Are you flying events? Are you, using the drones for cleaning, agriculture? So depending on what you're doing, then there's going to be a whole nother list of things that they look at. So again, going back to the process, it's just really making sure that you complete the application out, fully with all the different things that you may do. So then we can look at it and, get an idea of what you're planning on doing. So then we can get you a proper quote. But the rating is going to be, it's just so many different factors that come into play, but experience does play a big factor.
So it goes back to just what you were saying. All of those initial questions that they're filling out online. It's best to just sit down and fill them all out as best as you can, and to try to make sure you're getting that all of the different things, I guess, in that questionnaire filled out correctly. The more information, the better, which will prevent that a little bit of that back and forth. And then if there's any ambiguity, then the underwriter is going to charge the higher rate, not the lower rate, right?
Correct. Yeah. And if you have a riskier operation that, where there's a lot of claims, it's going to potentially be a higher premium as a higher risk. If you're doing something that's on a lower scale, that'll be reflected in the rate as well.
So what's typically the lowest scale and what's typically the highest scale, looking at that?
So going back to, those quotes we talked about previously, kind of our bare bones policy, the lower your liability limit. So it was 500,000 is the lowest we can go. And you're doing something like mapping where it's open space, there's no people around. It's going to be a lower risk versus someone who's trying to fly events where there's lots of people involved, buildings, and a much higher risk.
So if somebody's trying to cheat the system and they say, okay, I'm flying in a mapping thing because I know that that's the lowest rate that I'm going to possibly get. But then they have an incident where they're washing a building and they have an incident. How would that be handled? Or is that something, because maybe there's a one-off scenario, which really wouldn't be, I guess, let me back up, because would that be caught a little bit maybe during the interview process just based on the type of drone you're purchasing? Because the drone you're purchasing, if you're buying a pressure wash drone, it's a certain drone where it's not going to be a mapping drone, and you guys know that. Would that kind of work?
Yeah, that's definitely an indicator. The types of drones, like, we're going to request the serial numbers, the make and models. We're going to ask your intended uses and all of those things. And we are very aware of what drones are pressure washing drones, which drones are, mapping drones and all that. So if it comes back, it's going to get red flagged, and we're going to come back with additional questions like, hey, you have this type of drone, what is your intended use? You stated this, but that's not what this drone is used for. And the other thing is, you want to be truthful on this, because you're only going to hurt yourself in the long run. In the event of a claim and you did not complete the application properly, and you stated you were doing a certain risk, and in fact you had a claim with a completely different risk, there's a chance the company can decline to pay the claim, because they're going to go back to the application. They're going to conduct an investigation, on the claim. And if it's like, hey, there was no intended use for this, that could potentially hurt you in the long run. So I wouldn't recommend doing that, because you're paying for insurance and not being insured.
Right. So, I mean, you could liken that to, say, a surgeon who does surgery on toes, and then all of a sudden that's what he's claiming, right? And then he's doing brain surgery, where it's just not going to end up being covered, because there's a total different risk factor there.
Mm-hmm.
And once they realize, yes, this was you were doing this when you shouldn't have been.
Mm-hmm.
So cheating that system is going to do just like you're saying. You're going to be paying for insurance, be cheaper in the beginning, but then you're going to end up with this massive bill, because you're not going to be covered, and it's going to end up where the lawsuit is against you instead of against the insurance company, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, so if I have bad credit, felony, DWI, will those affect my rates?
They can. Credit, not so much, unless you're trying to get a loan on equipment. The bank's going to look at that. But for DWIs, felony records, yes, actions. Doesn't mean we can't quote you. We're just going to want to know a little bit more information on that, and it can affect rates.
And so typically, what I've seen in the past on things like that is it's about 5 years out. If it's 5 years out, it typically doesn't do anything. But if you've had 10 in the last 6 months, you should be jailed and everything taken away anyhow. But those are the types of things that are going to affect it. Anything 5 years past is probably good.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be nervous about if you do have a DUI or any felony charges. I wouldn't be worried about properly answering that question. Yes, it should give you a little drop down where you can put some more information. Say, hey, this is in 2018. I did all the courses I needed to. Everything's good. They're just going to not want to know why. But like you said, if there's a record, in the last 6 months, you've had 3 DUIs, they might look at that and be like, well, do we want this risk or not?
Yeah.
But generally, I've never seen those being an issue to get insurance.
Right. Okay. So is there a limit on how high a drone can go, or how far away a drone can be from the command center or the control? Anything like that?
Yeah, so it goes back to the FAA rules and Part 107 rules. So having a Part 107 license, you will be aware of all the rules of what you can and can't do. Right now, everything's line of sight. So, as long as you're within the parameters of the FAA requirements, I know there are, some changes coming where you can fly drones without, a line of sight. I've had a couple of requests come in, but there's a lot of additional questions, like what are you doing? What type of stuff? In some instances we can get a quote, and others we can't. So it's just really going to depend on the operation of what someone is planning on doing.
Yeah. So, and that also goes, so backing up, there is no, other than the FAA rules, there's nothing height wise that would restrict anything. And there's no changes on that, no matter what.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as you're being compliant with the FAA rules and regulations.
Gotcha. And with that, because one of the things that sits in my mind quite a bit is that if you get that drone up there 300-400 feet, 500-600 feet, whatever the case may be, you really can't see that stupid thing.
Well, then it goes back to the rules of line. This drone's needs to be in the line of sight. So then you're too far. Then you're out of that parameter, and that's when it gets sticky. And I believe, and I may be wrong, but I think it's like 400 feet of a building with a surfaced area is where a drone can go.
You kind of cut out on us
Yeah.
there. Say that one more time.
Oh, and I may be wrong, so don't hold me to this, but I believe it's 400 feet that you're legally allowed to fly over a building in the airspace.
Right. So, but I guess that's where kind of the point goes. So if the building is 400 feet tall, you can then go to 800 feet. But at 800 feet, you can't see it, kind of thing. You're kind of like, I mean, you got to have some really good,
yeah.
you got to be like binoculars and all that.
Yeah, you would have to be on top of the building.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so actually, you bring up a great point. Is there anything insurance-wise that would, if a company wants to go on top of the building and fly downward, is there anything insurance regulation-wise that's looked at in that aspect?
No, there are factors that, again, going to those FAA regulations, depending where's the building, are there people below you? Are you, legal to fly over people? So if you're going downward, so you got to take all those factors into play
Right.
when you're flying. So it really is dependent, if you are, is it a secluded building, out in the middle of nowhere, or is it a city? And then you also have to look at what are the city rules and regulations and municipality regulations of where you can fly and cannot fly a drone too. So on the insurance policies, you got to be following all the rules and laws that pertain to flying a drone. So not only the FAA rules, but there are different each city is going to have its own restrictions as well.
So as an example of that, if somebody is supposed to have received a waiver to do whatever it is they're doing, and they didn't get the waiver, they may not be covered if they fly.
Correct.
Gotcha. Very good. So what if this happens all the time in the contracting world? And that is, what if a customer wants to be, we touched on this before, listed as an additional insured? Is that a problem? And what if there's let's say I have $1 million policy and the customer says, I want a $5 million policy. Is there a way to get a rider for that particular job? How does that work? So first of all, the rider side, and then secondly, adding the additional insured.
Yeah, definitely. We get that request all the time. Generally, you're going to need $1 million liability. That's the standard. Larger companies might require more, or cities might require more. And we can definitely increase that. So depending on what you're doing, if you're doing a lot of work within the city or with this particular vendor, you might just want to increase your limits to what their minimum is. If you're not meeting that. Now, if it's a one-off job that you're doing for 3 days, we could do a short-term increase for that time frame. However, going back to, I think we touched on this before, is it can take 24 to 48 hours to get it all approved and get the documents out to you. So I always, any midterm change, you want to give notice, because if you have a job tomorrow, it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to get everything finalized and the documentation you need for that job in that short amount of time. But typically 24 to 48 hours and we have everything wrapped up.
Gotcha. All right. So this one's, I think, going to be a kind of a multifaceted question, but in the subcontracting world, if you're subcontracting a drone pilot, so you don't own the drone, you're not the pilot, whatever. If you're subcontracting a drone pilot that will use his or her drone and your equipment, how does one ensure that drone operator, that drone owner is insured and properly insured? Is there a way for me to call and find out that you're insured as a drone owner?
So if you're subcontracting a drone pilot and they have their own drone that they're going to be flying on your job, I would recommend that you request to be listed as an additional insured, and whatever your requirements are. So $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, whatever that may be. That's how you're going to know they have insurance, and you're going to be listed as additional insured. So they should have insurance on their equipment. And then same thing as your vendors are going to require you to carry insurance. I would require them to carry insurance and list your company as an additional insured.
As
So
an additional insured. Yeah.
yeah,
And that all makes sense. That's all part of the whole contracting world. It's the way it's so it's the same as anything else. So
yeah.
if I have a policy with you and I need to list somebody as an additional insured, is there a cost to me for that with your company?
Not as of now. I know there's been talk about it, but nothing in the near future is going to change. Right now, there's no cost. It's part of. I mean, drones. You're working different jobs all the time, so it's something you're going to need. So you request that COI. I always say 24, 48 hours to get the COI you need. However, we can usually, depending, if it's a simple COI, we can get it out within an hour usually. But always be prepared ahead of time, because if it's something that maybe is a little more complex, needs special verbiage for your vendor, it may take a little bit longer.
And for those of you that may or may not know, COI stands for Certificate of Insurance, that sort of thing. So if I borrow someone else's equipment, what's covered?
So depending on your
policy?
depending on your policy and depending on what you have and the type of policy, you may be covered, you may not be covered. Generally, most policies are going to cover the liability for non-owned drones. They never are going to cover the physical damage unless you add that. And you can add that, if you're renting equipment or borrowing equipment frequently, we would want to add that to your policy for the whole year. If it's a one-off job, you need to rent some special equipment for a specific job, we can add that coverage for that time frame.
Mm-hmm. And there is a company out there that is renting drones out, and for that you wouldn't. My guess, and maybe the answer to this, isn't that you need to go and get your insurance. You just get your insurance through that particular company that's renting out that drone. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah. So depending on the companies, some companies will provide insurance for their equipment, and then others don't, but they require you to have insurance before they're going to let their property, their drone equipment leave. So, so you might need a COI, a certificate of insurance for that. Just depending on where you're using that equipment. If you're borrowing something from a friend, that's fine, but you want to make sure that you have the coverages you need. Typically the liability side is covered. Before just assuming it is, call your agent and just double check what's covered, what's not covered. And if we need to add some coverages, we can do that.
And so what are some of you field phone calls and emails and stuff like that all the time on drones and insurance and all that. What are some of the biggest questions or misunderstandings that you happen to find coming into you on a regular basis?
The biggest, I would say, misunderstanding is people assume, like, hey, I have my first job, I need insurance. And I think the big misunderstanding is they think that the drone insurance is also a commercial general business liability policy. So they think it's covering the business and the drone, it's everything all in one, which it's not. Drone insurance is specific to aviation and the drone. General business insurance, it's not uncommon to need those. I think we talked about this previously, to need those two separate insurances, but that's a very common, I guess, assumption that people make is that, well, I thought I was covered. I thought my business was covered because I have insurance with you. Well, it is for the aviation aspect of your operation, but it's not covering your autos, it's business autos. It's not covering your office space if you have it, your commercial general business responsibilities, workers' comp, anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's only the aerial aspects of it, period. Because truly it's not drone insurance, it's aviation insurance that covers a drone. So you could get the same basic policies if it were a Cessna or a Boeing or whatever type of an airplane, because it's an aviation policy, not a drone quote unquote policy.
Yeah, and like we talked about before, it's all of like your commercial general lines are going to exclude aviation. So that's why you need this specific coverage as well.
And they also exclude we've already said this before in previous, but they exclude your vehicles and maritime and, all these kinds of things. You can't get a boat and go offshore and expect your general liability is covering it the same way as it's not going to cover the aviation policy and all that. So
exactly. So yeah, that would be the biggest one that comes through. Most questions are just general, wanting to know what does this policy cover, and we'll go through that in depth, and it depends on what you choose. Do you want liability only? Do you want the full coverage with the liability and the coverage of your drone? Personal injury, different coverages like that are typically included in the policy. So it'll cover you for just about everything you need on the drone aviation insurance side.
Well, that's what really surprised me when we covered, the actual cost of drone insurance, is that it was really, in my opinion, it was stupid cheap. When you look at the general liability side of it, where the expense started coming in is when you started looking at covering the equipment side of it. Mm-hmm. So the more equipment that you cover, the rate went up. And I'm not saying that this is what you're going to be quoted at, but somewhere that 900 to 1500 range is for the general liability side, and then up there around 7,000 for the year for covering all the different types of equipment. Now again, that's not a quote or not something you can count on, but those were kind of the number ranges that we saw last time when talking about general liability versus equipment and all that kind of stuff. So to me, it's really, especially on the general liability side, it's so stupid cheap that it doesn't make sense not to have it. Yeah. Even if you don't want to cover. And I think most people want to cover their equipment, but then they realize how expensive it is, and then they don't. So, and that to me is also where training comes in. And if you don't have jobs, go out there and practice and try and keep up your skills and that kind of thing. So.
Build your hours. It may not reduce the premium significantly, but if you have zero time on a cleaning drone and then you come back, in a year at renewal, we update those hours, that could potentially reduce the premium because you have a lot more experience under your belt at that point.
So would a logbook be helpful? I mean, or does it need to be logged, or?
There's no requirement saying it needs to be logged, but I would absolutely, because those are questions that we ask, especially on the large drones and drones over 55 pounds or drones pushing that. That is going to be a question on the application. How many hours do you have flying any drones, just little drones, big drone, everything in between? And then how many hours do you have specifically with this type of drone that you have insured? And I have seen premiums reduce because of people gaining more experience. So, the more experience you have, the more insurable you are. So, exactly. Yeah. And I did just think of one other, I guess, common question is I will have people, they are starting a new business, whether it's a cleaning business, whatever it is, and they purchase a bunch of equipment, and it could be all expensive to purchase everything at once. So they finance it. And so they'll come in and they'll want the bare minimum liability insurance only.
And they can't.
But what happens is they don't tell us, like, it's financed. We bind the policy. And then after the fact, like, oh, my bank is a certificate of insurance. Well, absolutely, we can do that, but you do not have the proper coverage. Your bank is going to require you to have full coverage in case something happened to the equipment, that the bank, that your loss payee is going to get reimbursed if the drone has been paid off. Just like buying a car, they're going to require you to carry, full coverage. So if you are financing your drone equipment, make sure that you give us a detail of everything that was financed, broken out, so we can quote you for all of that equipment to satisfy the bank's insurance requirement needs. And definitely, as we talked about previously, it is more expensive to insure the value of all the equipment. So you have to factor that in when you are going to finance equipment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because just like you're saying, then it's not a choice on your part whether or not you want to
Mm-hmm.
cover the equipment, because the bank is going to require it. So in that aspect, if you're calling around just to get a quote before you make your purchase, and you say, "Oh, I don't want to cover that. Oh, I don't want to cover that. Oh, I don't want to cover that," you need to think about that, because if you're going to finance, you're going to have to cover that unless you're taking a second mortgage on your home or something like that
Mm-hmm.
to pay cash for the drone, kind of a thing. So
Correct.
those are important things to think of, because I can actually see where filling out the quote just to find out what it's going to get, and no, I don't want to cover the equipment, or let me go down on the cost of equipment, or something like that, just to get a lower rate. And then you get this quote and it's like $2,500. And you're like, oh, wow, that's awesome, I can afford that. And then all of a sudden you get the real quote, because now you got to do it, and it's $7,000 or $8,000. You're like, oh, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. So definitely, if you are planning on financing equipment, you want to budget everything in. And if you don't get drone insurance through us, the bank will provide an insurance that's probably 4 times the cost of a typical drone policy or aviation policy. So, and they don't give you an option.
A lot of people don't actually realize that. That's a very good point, that if you do not get the insurance, or like, let's say that I get the insurance just to satisfy the bank, and then right after it's all done, I call you and I say, hey, Miss Nicole, I want to drop this rate down, so I no longer want to cover the equipment because I've already sent that to the bank, right? The very first thing that happens is your system is going to kick a letter out to the bank saying, hey, this is no longer insured. Now the insurance company can come back and say, you have to immediately insure this thing, or we're buying a policy, and we don't care what the cost is. We're gonna transfer that cost onto you. Instead of your payment being $1,000 a month, it just went up to $2,500 a month to cover that insurance policy. So you got to
exactly. Yeah. So yeah, those are the two big ones. I think a lot of people think process in buying equipment.
Very good. Well, I really appreciate this. Is there anything else that you want to add in? Insurance?
I don't have anything else, but if anyone out there has questions, they can always reach out to me via email or phone, and I could give you my email again. It's Nicole.
Yeah. What's your email address? What's your phone number? And what's because it's bwifly.com, but
yeah,
what's the email address and the phone number for you?
So it'd be nicole.royer@bwifly.com. Phone number is 949-272-0145. And then our website is bwifly.com.
That's awesome.
Nicole, shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to answer questions that y'all have.
Sounds perfect. I appreciate it, Ms. Nicole, and thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.